Hello, it's Tuesday, June 14th, and this is the meeting of the Town of Oakville Council to consider our parks and open space strategy. Madam Clerk, do we have any regrets for this meeting?
Yes, Mayor Burton, we have regrets from Councillor Sandhu.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Council, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? Madam Clerk, I see none. Council, today's only business is to consider the report and provide feedback to the Planning Services Department, the Parks and Open Space Department, and the Finance Department. And you've all had a chance to read that, and I'm looking forward to a presentation and our discussion. Mr. Mark, are you on deck for this? Chris Mark, our Director of Parks and Open Space, now has everybody's attention.
Good morning, Mayor Burton and members of Council. It is my pleasure to lead off this morning to discuss our Parks Plan 2031. This report is a joint effort between Parks and Open Space, Planning, and the Finance Departments. The consulting firm of the Planning Partnership, assisted by NBLC, are the consultants retained to assist us in the development of this Parks Plan. Ron Palmer of the Planning Partnership and Matt Bennett with NBLC are here with us this morning. Oakville is on the cusp of the next phase of growth, intensification within our strategic growth areas. This requires us to develop an urban parkland strategy and parks hierarchy that requires a different type and scale of parkland that has been acquired, planned, and developed in the past. This morning, you will receive a presentation on developing an urban parks plan within our strategic growth areas to continue building on the existing park system we have today. Oakville is blessed with a wonderful park system. Oakville Council has always been a leader in parks visioning and parks planning for our residents. But developing a park system evolves over time and must change and reflect the growth of the community, and that planning must be done in tandem with the urban structure and the community plan. Parks planning, park acquisition is always changing and evolving. In its infancy as a town, Oakville's park system was once a series of small parkettes containing a playground and a bench. Large-scale parks were not required due to low population. Residents had large land and a good amount of private amenity space. The park provision, location, and size of the parks reflected the planning of the day and the needs of the community at that time. Through growth and subdivision development north of the QEW to Dundas, planning became extremely important in the design, size, and locations of our parks, as neighborhood parks became carefully planned and integrated within our communities. We developed suburban parks that are linked with environmental features such as our river valleys, woodlots, stormwater ponds, to create an integrated and a cohesive park system. Large community parks with multiple lit fields were built to accommodate the rise in youth of adult sport, participation, and the changing leisure needs of our community. The parks are very much reflective of the community that is being designed and developed. A need for a change in how we plan parks in Oakville is seen again in the planning and the development of the North Oakville East Secondary Plan. A community planned with a compact urban form. The parks plan is reflective of that urban structure and that community design. North Oakville, as a planned walkable community, will have over 30 village squares as neighborhood gathering spaces, all within a 10-minute walk. Our much larger neighborhood parks use land more efficiently and have more open space for informal play for residents who do not have large lots and small private amenity space. The neighborhood parks become the outdoor living room for this community as residents attend these parks in large numbers. The park plan for North Oakville is reflective of the urban structure, the community plan, all planned in the context of the 900 hectares of our natural heritage system. Now we turn our focus on the next 10 years of development of our town from a suburban context to an urban form that requires a parks plan for the large numbers of residents that will reside within these highly urban areas. A parks plan for our strategic growth areas requires looking at them in a very different lens in comparison to the way we have created suburban parks in the past. Different in the way we acquire parks, design parks, categorize parks, and maintain parks, and the way parkland dedication is calculated and accounted. Your Worship, with those introductory comments, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Mr. Ron Palmer of the Planning Partnership for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mark. Welcome, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. Great to be here in person. That seems to be the trend starting last week. I do have a brief presentation, which I'll go through, and I have Matt Bennett here from MBLC, who's also going to help me with the presentation on one or two of the slides. To begin, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context within which we're working, although Mr. Mark did a great job laying the groundwork for what we're doing. Importantly, there's been new legislation within which we are required to work. And I'll give you a bit of an overview of what those pieces of legislation do to your parkland dedication bylaw. And I'm going to go through a number of the key issues that have been identified through the work, and then we'll be here happy to answer any questions that you might have. We started this work with 4 goals in mind.
Sorry to interrupt you. The mic isn't quite picking you up. So I suggest if you, I don't know, stand here and speak into the mic, it would be, you're kind of stepping past it.
Sorry. It's been a couple of years. We're trying to create a comprehensive document. We do deal with greenfield forms of development, but the primary focus, as Mr. Mark identified, is your strategic growth areas, because that's what is going to be different. Oakville has done an amazing job creating a wonderful park system. So we're looking at best practices from around Ontario. However, everyone in the Greater Golden Horseshoe is doing this exact study at this time, because there's a deadline. I'll get into that when we talk about the legislative elements. We want to make sure that we're getting you the right park system in your strategic growth areas, the right amount, the right types of parks, and the right kind of design elements that go with that. Absolutely trying to be responsive to the needs of the community going forward, and in this particular case to the year 2031. And that also gets to the issue of flexibility, where we want the town of Oakville to have all of the tools necessary to create and to continue to create a great, diverse park system going forward. So the discussion of the Planning Act is a bit complex. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I'm going to try and hit some highlights for you. Under the Planning Act, Section 42 is the opportunity to achieve parkland, typically through the traditional draft plan of subdivision process. Section 51 of the Planning Act is utilized when site plan approval is involved. Over the years, there's been a number of legislative changes that have affected how Section 42 and Section 51 are to be utilized. The first one of those back in 2016 was Bill 73. That came out of a hearing on parkland dedication in the town of Richmond Hill. Fundamental to that bill was the requirement to prepare a parks plan, and that's what we're doing here, is preparing that parks plan. It also changed the metrics in the Planning Act a little bit. It used to say an alternative residential rate was 1 hectare per 300 dwelling units for both a land dedication and for the opportunity for cash in lieu of land. The legislative element kept the alternative rate of 1 hectare per 300 dwelling units for land dedication, but changed the cash in lieu calculation to 1 hectare 500 dwelling units. That's a very important metric that we need to talk about today. Bill 197 in 2020 identified in the Planning Act that for the first time, the parkland dedication bylaw is subject to appeal. Before that, they were always prepared and approved by council with no opportunity for appeal. The other important part of Bill 197 is that we have a deadline. And in order to use the alternative rates for residential development identified in the Planning Act, council needs to have a new parkland dedication bylaw in place by September 18th of this year. More recently, just a few weeks ago, we got Bill 109. In Bill 109, there is reference to parkland dedication for what the province calls transit-oriented communities. They didn't use the terminology from the growth plan, which was major transit station areas. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been working towards trying to find a definition of transit-oriented communities to determine whether or not that piece of legislation applies to Oakville or not. Currently, I would say it does not, because there's a Transit-Oriented Communities Act, which is very specific to subway development in Toronto, Richmond Hill, Markham. So we're not sure it applies, but we need to know that it's out there just in case it does. The first issue identified in the work is the town's current parkland target, which is 2.2 hectares per 1,000 people. To date, the town of Oakville has done a terrific job achieving that number, and so far, you're at about 2.56 hectares of active developed parkland per 1,000 people. What's also great, and what's shown on the mapping, is that the park system is really well distributed throughout the neighborhoods of the town. You have a great system. It's well distributed, and it is in the metric that you've been trying to achieve for the past few years. The other thing that's really important here in Oakville that is a bit unique in my experience is that you think about your system of parks as a campus of parks. And what that means, and what I've been told it means, is that it really talks about parks are not necessarily all required to provide the same facilities, but that the system itself provides a host of facilities throughout the system, meaning that the whole system is greater than the individual parks that comprise it. That's really important. One of the recommendations we're making in this report is that the town continue to utilize the active parkland target of 2.2 hectares per 1,000 people, certainly until the time horizon of this parks plan and subsequent parkland dedication bylaw, which is to the year 2031. We do point out in the report that over time, as Oakville builds out and land resources become more scarce, that you may need to look at adjusting the 2.2 hectares per 1,000, maybe not the number, but potentially the definition or what counts towards active parkland. Certainly, we don't believe that that is necessary in this piece of work. So part of that recommendation was what other types of lands might you consider? You can explore opportunities for certain elements of the natural heritage system. You also have Bronte Provincial Park and other lands owned by the Conservation Authority that have some elements that are not natural heritage features. Those could be considered depending upon their active function. Certainly, we also believe that parkland dedication under the Planning Act is not your only tool to acquire parks. So we've put together a list of other types of tools that the municipality should have available when you're not achieving everything through Section 42 or Section 51 of the Planning Act. The second issue, and Mr. Mark discussed this a bit, was that we're trying to create a new hierarchy for the strategic growth areas, a much more urban park hierarchy. Again, you've done an amazing job on your traditional neighborhood hierarchy, and that should continue to apply as North Oakville continues to develop. But in your strategic growth areas, there are different types of parks, they're designed differently, they're maintained differently, and they have different names and criteria that go along with them. We've identified 6 different types of park, going from quite large areas within a strategic growth area to quite small parts, which a sliver park is really an expanded sidewalk where there can be spillover space for cafes and outdoor retail. So we've promoted this, we've provided some design guidelines that go with it, and importantly, an understanding of the cost to develop an urban park system. Our experience across Ontario indicates that generally an urban park costs 10 times more to build than a traditional neighborhood park. And they also cost about 10 times more to maintain, just given the amount of use that they receive. The next element of our work is trying to establish what is the parkland dedication metric that the town should be looking for in various contexts. The traditional requirements come straight from the Planning Act, and they're maximum percentages of gross land area. Commercial industrial has been 2% of gross land area for quite some time. Other uses that are not residential or commercial and industrial are 5%. And typically, greenfield residential is 5% or 1 hectare per 300 dwelling units. It's an interesting way of calculating how much parkland is necessary, and the work that we've done indicates that up to a density of about 50 persons per hectare on a gross basis, 5% achieves the greatest parkland dedication. Once you get into higher density greenfield situations, then the 1 hectare per 300 generates the greater parkland system, although they're relatively close. Another element of growth in Oakville is outside of your strategic growth areas, you will be accommodating some levels of intensification. Here, we've broken it down into 3 categories: large scale, small scale, and the newer element called additional residential units. That came from Bill 108. So where we're looking at larger scale elements of intensification, and the way we've defined that is that that's an application that has not been anticipated by your official plan and requires an official plan amendment. And we would suggest that parkland dedication be calculated in the same way as intensification within a strategic growth area. In terms of smaller scale intensification, things that are anticipated in your official plan, but it's new development within an existing community, we feel that the town should establish a set rate per additional unit as a way to capture the additional demands on the park system. As for additional residential units, we are suggesting an exemption for additional residential units as a way to promote and incentivize the development of those housing types within an existing community. In a strategic growth area, the numbers become dramatically different in terms of how they're calculated and what the outcomes are in terms of the fiscal impact of development. We believe that in a strategic growth area, for comprehensive planning purposes, you want about 7.5% to 12% of the gross land area in park. So that's kind of a starting point. And that we would want on every significant site, and in this case, we've identified 1,500 square meters, we want an actual land contribution to the park system within the strategic growth area. Those two things work together because what ends up happening is that when you apply a metric to urban forms of development, you're going to generate both land and cash in lieu of land. And the discussion becomes, when do you require land and when do you require cash in lieu of land? That's important because the land values within a strategic growth area and the need for an urban park system are very important, and that's identified as a land dedication. However, the opportunity also exists through most forms of urban development to get the land pieces that you need and also generate cash in lieu. That cash in lieu is based on the land value in the strategic growth area. That doesn't mean you have to acquire land within the strategic growth area. You will have to do some, but certainly the opportunity to achieve significant areas of land with the cash generated within a strategic growth area will go a long way to acquiring lands elsewhere within the town that keeps you up to date on that 2.2 hectares per thousand people, your active parkland target. We also want to make sure that within your toolbox, you will be allowing off-site land dedication. That means that the municipality doesn't always have to be the one looking for opportunities for land acquisition for parks, but that you can consider appropriate pieces of property that may be dedicated or acquired on your behalf by the development industry. I'm going to ask Matt Bennett to come up and talk about this important slide for a minute.
Good morning, Mayor and members of Council. Working with staff, our project team developed a straightforward approach to link parkland need with land costs throughout the town. The approach references anticipated population growth within the strategic growth areas to 2031, which is about 5,000 units towards the bottom of the slide here, 4,907 units. Land need is then quantified based on the town's existing 2.2 hectares per thousand person population service provision target. This results in a total land need of 23.7 hectares to 2031. This is future parkland need throughout the strategic growth areas themselves. This need is then distributed across the growth areas and across identified parkland priorities the town and staff have identified, other areas of the town, and the strategic growth areas themselves. This drives a total parkland need of about $187 million in current value. When we then deduct the current cash in lieu reserve account of about $78 million, that drives a net parkland cost of $110 million, $109,274,870. This is then distributed across that anticipated growth within the strategic growth areas, the 4,907 units. And in simple present value dollars, that would create a per unit cost for cash in lieu of park at $22,269.
Thanks, Matt. As you can see, there's a number of assumptions that are inherent to this formula, and we've been working with staff to get those right. This is a very important part of our work and will eventually in some form find its way into the parkland dedication bylaw. It's really important because it does set that quantum for parkland dedication or cash in lieu within the strategic growth areas and where major intensification is proposed through an official plan amendment. The fourth issue that we've delved into in the report are about options for ownership. And here there are three primary types of ownership that we can look at for park acquisition, park securement within the town of Oakville. The first one, and I've left out the most important one, which is fee simple parkland, which is you just get the land. Another option is what they call strata ownership. That's permitted under the Condominiums Act. That is land that is dedicated to the municipality, but is typically built over top of a parking garage or some other land use where the ownership is stratified through the condominium corporation. Here, with strata ownership, the municipality is the owner, is responsible for design, development, and ongoing maintenance. Certainly, we believe that this is a tool that needs to be considered, but there needs to be criteria through which you would accept a strata park. Certainly, also, the value of the park should be reduced in recognition of the fact that about every 40 years it has to be replaced, given that it's built over top of something else and the membranes wear out. We think that it's a possible tool in a greenfield situation, and we've heard instances where municipalities have accepted a strata park over top of a stormwater management facility or other facilities like that in an effort to be more efficient in the use of land. Within the strategic growth areas, it's a very important tool to allow the development of larger scale park elements, again, over top of parking garages or other underground facilities. Again, key here, subject to a discount, recognizing life cycle costing. The third type of ownership, and it's not actual ownership, but it's securement through legal agreements, is a POP, privately owned public space. This has become more and more popular. We expect that these would be for the smaller scale elements of the urban park system. And we believe that they should be given some level of credit, of course, reduced based on lack of ability to program, as well as life cycle costs. And certainly, they are really important elements and interesting elements. The key is the legal agreement that goes with the POP, which is a legal agreement that indicates that it has to be designed to municipal standards, it has to be maintained to municipal standards, and it has to be open and accessible to the public. Where they exist, it's important that they look and feel and function as a piece of the public park system. The last key issue is dealing with cash in lieu. And what's really important is that you're going to be receiving cash in lieu through urban forms of development in your strategic growth areas. So it's important that it's understood who gets to decide when cash in lieu is appropriate over land, or what percentage is land and what percentage is cash in lieu. And it's important that the bylaw identify that it's at the discretion of council. Seems to be a very simple, straightforward thing, but it's very few bylaws actually say it's at the discretion of the town. Certainly, the idea of having a prioritization of what you're going to use cash in lieu for is an important part of talking about what you're going to use the land for. Certainly, the idea is to, where you need it, to buy land in proximity to the development that is generating the money. Secondly, would be to buy land anywhere else within the town of Oakville in order to keep you up to date on your 2.2 hectares per thousand people. And it's really important to have a plan to spend the money. Spending the money is a very important element of collecting the money. Inflation means that money in the bank is not the same as the land value that you acquired the money from. So it's important to have a strategy in place that allows the money to be used as quickly as possible. One of the other tools that we thought might be interesting for the town of Oakville is the establishment of a land bank. That allows the municipality to acquire land through cash in lieu, keep it in your land bank, and use that for future parks or for trades or sale to generate money at real-time value when you're ready to make an acquisition. This is the last slide. In terms of next steps, we're here today to try and answer as many questions as we can. And then between June 24th and August 9th, we expect to do a bit of a public consultation process. We'll be meeting with the development industry and interested stakeholders. August 9th, we're looking for a public meeting where we'll be presenting a draft parkland dedication bylaw to the year 2031, and then hopefully back on September 6th for adoption of that bylaw. And with that, I thank you for your time, and we're all here to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much for walking us through your report, which I'm pretty sure every member of council pored over before the meeting. And you have nevertheless generated enough questions to keep you busy for quite a while here. We're going to start with Councillor Chisholm.
Thank you, Worship. This report is almost a paradigm shift in how we think about acquisitions of parkland and redesign and looking at different alternatives. I'm very impressed with the recommendations and where we're moving forward. The question I have, a couple of questions. One, in the initial, and help me out to understand, the initial presentation, you talked about 2.2 hectares per 1,000. Now with intensification and everything building up and so forth, how do we acquire 2.2 hectares per 1,000 when you have intensification and population increases in those growth areas? How do we accommodate that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's a great question and something we've been working on throughout this process. We look at the 2.2 hectares per 1,000 as a town-wide objective. And as I mentioned, we don't believe that you can achieve 2.2 hectares per 1,000 in a strategic growth area. So we're looking for a certain percentage of the land area within a strategic growth area to be land dedication. And then the rest of the dedication requirement would be cash in lieu or an off-site parkland dedication that would augment the supply of parkland elsewhere in the town so that you're still achieving the 2.2 hectares per 1,000. What's interesting is that the land values within a strategic growth area are substantially higher than elsewhere in the town, so that the money generated will go a long way to helping the town achieve active parkland target.
Good, that's good to know. The other questions I have, what kind of my antenna went up, was this banking of parkland, land banking, I think you called it. Yeah, and I guess how we look at that's a future, the acquisitions and moving quickly to pick up lands that are available. If by chance, saying down the line, maybe 10, 15 years, we bank this property or this site or land piece, and we don't require it anymore, do we have the ability to resale that property to a private developer?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's another really good question. My expectation would be that the land bank would be similar to the cash in lieu bank account that you have to establish, so that if you were to sell a parcel that's in your land bank for something that's not a parkland element, I think the money would have to go back into the cash in lieu account. So I don't think you could simply sell it back to the developer and use the money for anything you wanted. I think it would have to go back into cash in lieu.
Okay, thank you. And I think my last question is, with the discretion of the municipality of setting the rates, the fees for that you were talking about for hold on, I forgot what the name was, but is there can developers appeal the cash in lieu, that's cash in lieu of parkland? If we have at the discretion of the municipality, we set the rate. Can they appeal to OLT on the fee?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, and that was the key change in Bill 197. So they can appeal both the bylaw and any individual assignment of cost. So they can appeal it at the bylaw stage or individually as they work through the process.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, my last question with respect to September 22nd. Is it, I know we're having a special council meeting on this, so I would assume there's a time constraint or a drop deadline with respect to getting our plans in place for the provincial government under official plan umbrella. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, absolutely correct. There is no ability to utilize the alternative rate for residential development if you don't have a bylaw in place in September.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Dudek.
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. Similar to what Councillor Chisholm had raised, the whole issue of at the discretion of the town. Does our bylaw currently have that within the existing bylaw?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I don't believe it does.
Okay. The one question I would have would be, if we do something like that, I'm thinking more in terms of the affordable housing component, that with land prices being what they are, quite often we hear from developers that the cash in lieu rather, is prohibitive for them for costs for developing on a property. I know we got a letter from an individual who stipulated what his end costs would be based on our current cash in lieu of parkland costs. Would that be something we could provide in the bylaw if we stipulated something to that effect?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's a fantastic question that I've heard every time I've been working on one of these projects. And we're doing two things. First of all, one of the reasons I have Matt Bennett on my team is he is running development pro formas based on numbers that we're generating to understand the impact on the financial feasibility of development. That's really important because with the community benefits charge coming up as well as potential changes to development charges, it's the package of those three fees that are really important, and they need to work together and they cannot duplicate. So we are looking very carefully at the fiscal feasibility of the numbers. That's number
Thank
one. Number two, there is a part in the bylaw where council has the opportunity to exempt certain forms of development from parkland dedication. Sorry, I've moved around. There you are. That can be a straight exemption in the bylaw, or it can be a potential exemption subject to conversations with the developer at the time.
Okay, thank you. I'm really pleased to hear that, as you mentioned, a comprehensive look at the various factors that do impact the costs of development. Again, as I say, especially from affordable housing standpoint. In terms of this, the bylaw and then the appeal to the OLT. So the bylaw is basically similar to what we go through with anything else, whether it be committee of adjustment. There's a time period whereby the developer or anyone could appeal our bylaw. Once those appeals are dealt with, the bylaw would become in effect. So then the only stipulation or the only concern would be going forward that a developer could appeal it to the OLT. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's absolutely correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Councillor Knoll?
Thank you, Worship. Thank you to our presenter. It was a really good presentation, an excellent report. Thank you to Councillor Duddick and Councillor Chisholm for anticipating my questions as well. I think the question regarding the cost of development in conjunction with our current work on affordability is going to be one of the key questions going forward to how we implement this and how we manage that. But I still have a couple less important questions, but still important to me. One is I'm curious about the strata ownership concept. And are there examples of where this works, and what are the pitfalls of this? I can only imagine that this has got to be a very challenging way of achieving parkland when you're working with these sorts of long-term arrangements in terms of putting aside capital money and what happens about defaults and all sorts of things. Are there examples of where this works, and what are the pitfalls of this kind of arrangement?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, strata parks are all over Toronto, and usually most of the municipalities in the Greater Toronto Area have a few examples of strata parks themselves. I'm not sure if Oakville does. However, it is a fairly common approach. The key is the agreement that goes with it. And there are some pretty significant pros and cons to the strata park arrangement. I believe I've identified some of those in the report. However, I've done this type of work with other municipalities and worked through fairly rigorously the legal implications of the strata framework. And again, it tends to boil down to the strength of the legal agreement that goes with the strata ownership. But it's important to remember that you own the sliver, the strata.
Right. So that's where the word strata comes from. So we essentially own what's on top, and they own what's below.
Correct.
So in terms of it, what you made the comment that that requires replacement every 40 years. When you say that, you're meaning the strata requires replacement, not necessarily the facility underneath. Is that correct?
Typically, and in discussion with a host of landscape architects that I work with, it's the rubber membrane begins to break down after about 40 years, and it has to be replaced before leaking creates any significant damage.
Okay, and so in these agreements, typically who holds responsibility for that? Is that something that the municipality maintains financial responsibility for? Or is there something that is cost shared? How is that typically addressed?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's typically the municipality who is responsible for that. That's why we suggest that the value of the Strata Park be discounted
Yeah.
to anticipate that life cycle cost implication.
Yeah, there'd have to be that as well as creating some sort of reserve account for, I guess, managing those long-term costs. On the other privately owned parks, I guess a question to staff. I'll just put a pin in this. Do we have strata agreements in Oakville now? I'm not aware of one if we do, but I'm curious if we do and what that relationship has been with the developers. Privately owned parks and spaces. Can you provide an example of, first of all, do we have one in Oakville that you know of? And can you give examples of how these work and what the challenges are for these?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Again, I'm not aware if Oakville has widely used POPs. It is kind of a new element. Certainly they exist in Toronto and in other cities in North America. The key with a POP is, again, it remains in the ownership of the condominium corporation or the owner of the building. However, there's the legal agreement that makes sure that it's open and accessible to the public. It's a good way to get smaller, interesting pieces of robust urban public space element without actually being the owner. So in this case, you're not responsible for development, maintenance, and replacement. Some of the challenges are when it's time to update the POP, the fear is that the condominium corporation doesn't want to do it anymore. Yeah. And they don't want to pay for the cost.
Or have the resources to do it would be another issue, I guess.
That could also be another issue. Again, the quality of the legal agreement is extremely important here.
Okay. Well, I will yield the floor to other councillors. I know there's lots of hands up, so thank you again for your questions, your answers, and for the report. I look forward to working through this in the months to come.
Thank you, Councillor Knoll, for your courtesy. Councillor Longo.
Thank you, Your Worship, Mr. Palmer and town staff. Excellent report. I think it really brings a lot together. I had a couple questions and comments as it relates to the economic value of parks. Table 1 on page 17. So it talks about a bunch of different values and how they're measured. Is it possible to see how many apply to Oakville and how they can be quantified specifically for Oakville? You don't have to answer that now, but you give examples, and it would be good to see how many do actually apply to Oakville.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm happy to do that.
And then the other part is, I think with the recent citizens survey that came out in February 2022, it'd be interesting to somehow connect what the perception is of residents and businesses of Oakville, specifically residents, because it was a resident survey. But when they say 93% of the residents thought that parks and green space, they had high value, harbors and waterfront. And then when we looked at the top priorities for the citizens, it talked about 20% looking at protecting and maintaining parks, trails and green spaces. So I think there's something there potentially that we can connect to the strategy, given the interest of the residents and the value they place on that, somehow, seeing if we can quantify that and value that as well, just as a thought. I think recommendation 4, which is related to the comprehensive parkland acquisition strategy, I think that again is excellent. So it'd be good to know which acquisition strategies are probably the most effective and how we can actually leverage those. So again, I think it has to be kind of a holistic approach to it, but I think that gives really good levers to be able to acquire land for the town. And then on page 33, the recommendation 11, talking about promoting a more sustainable park and space development approach that requires less maintenance. I've always been and I think Oakville's done an excellent job. And actually one of the reasons I moved here back in 2001 was because of how nature was integrated into the town, unlike other municipalities, Mississauga as an example. And so you can actually, a lot of the communities were connected by green space and really well maintained. So like the buckthorn management approach that the town is taking. So I think the question is the health of then the open space and the parks. How do we factor that in? Because it's great to have them as seen as park, but are they actually healthy and functioning? If there could be a statement of that as we look at being able to have this strategy, how do we ensure that we can see that it's actually healthy, the natural spaces and the natural heritage system, as well as the other parks and how they're connected? And then the last comment that I kind of wanted to make is on page 41, there's examples of urban parkland systems in different urban centers around Canada and North America. Is there a way of then putting Oakville in there to see how we measure up to them? Because it mentions a list of them, but it doesn't actually specifically talk about Oakville.
Through you,
And those
Mr.
are kind of
Mayor.
my comments. Like fantastic report. I think it's a great basis to work with. So thank you for that.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes to all of those things. We can have a look, and perhaps a summary of the public survey in the report would be a useful element. So I'll work with staff to bring that forward.
Thank you.
All right, Councillor Adams, I think, is next.
Thank you very much for the report. It was really interesting to read, and it goes through an awful lot of information. I've got sort of two areas of questions. One I'll describe as kind of what do we get credit for questions, and then the other is a particular issue that I've got around design standards. But the first area of question I have has to do in part with the map that you had, I think, as part of your presentation, and it's on page 10 of 68 of the agenda, or page 4 of the report. And it shows a whole bunch of lands that we have, or we might consider as being kind of part of the parks world. And I noticed in Northeast Oakville a couple of sites that didn't seem to show up on the map, and that included 2 school sites. So I didn't see Joshua Creek Public School, and I didn't see St. Marguerite School there. So there are 2 yellow squares that didn't seem to be on that map that I thought ought to be on the map. We also just acquired from the region the Trafalgar Reservoir site on Trafalgar Road. That's not on the map. And so I wondered, for those 2 things, how does that impact our categorization, our numbers, our rates? What does that do to us?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, certainly we'll go back and have a look at the mapping and the data. In terms of the impact on the numbers, there could be an impact on the amount of park space per 1,000 people. My expectation, it might go up. However, we've been counting only improved parks, and the school board's lands don't count in the active parkland number. However, they would count in the overall number. So there could be an impact.
My apologies. So the school sites, which they obviously are improved with a school on them, and they've both cases they've got a big blacktop kind of space, so it's not really entirely green space for sure. Are we incorporating them in our all of the school site as part of our hectares per 1,000 people kind of thing?
They're not part of the active parkland target at all.
So they're kind of above and beyond what we're targeting.
That's correct.
Okay, so it's kind of part of our campus, but not part of our target. Okay, that's really helpful to understand. I wanted to make sure I understood that properly. Then I have there's another category that doesn't really get directly covered here, and it's walkways. We have dozens, if not hundreds, of walkways throughout our neighborhoods that connect streets to parkways or parks all across our neighborhoods. they're often these kind of concrete walkway spaces between two homes. How are they incorporated in this? Do they get categorized somewhere else? What happens to those? In a way, they're part of our trail system. Many of them are actually maintained by Parks and Open Space. Where do they fit in?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm gonna ask town staff to weigh in on that one.
Through you, Your Worship, the walkway connections to parks are included within our active parkland calculation.
They are. So so those small blocks that would be between two homes, we get credit for, whatever that land area is?
They are, yes, and many of them are landscaped, as you know, and they are connectors to the park, so we do include them in our active parkland calculation.
Okay, so excellent. Happy to hear that answer. The last question I have about the sort of land credit issues is specific areas, the parkway lands. How are they categorized? Those are the lands that are over near 9th Line and Upper Middle Road. They're owned by the province. We've got this long-term lease on them that goes out to 2034. We don't own them. We haven't improved them. They get used kind of as a passive park land, as people walk on them with their dogs and stuff like that. Is that the kind of land that one day we might consider as part of a land bank for park use? If we could have actually acquired them from the province and get to choose what kind of park we put on it. Is that what you have in mind?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to defer the first part of your question back to staff, but the second part, if it doesn't count today, certainly we'd be looking for opportunities like that to begin counting them as part of your overall inventory. If you're able to secure them and improve them so that they would meet your definition of active parkland. But for the first part, I'll ask Chris to jump in.
Through you, Your Worship, the 9th Line lands are partially active parkland. We consider anything we have under active long-term lease as active parkland for the residents of the town. So in the 9th Line area, the Crusaders and the area that they have under lease would be considered active parkland. It's actively maintained. And the rest of the Joshua Creek area is categorized as undeveloped and would be potentially, should the town be in a position to acquire it in the future, could become a combination of both active and passive parkland, recognizing that the creek that runs through it. So that is an opportunity in the future to expand the active parkland within the town.
So right now, because we don't actually own it, does it fall under the? I lost my page here. Does that fall under the use agreements or easements kind of categorization of how we view our ownership?
That's correct, because it's under long-term lease.
Okay, and so in terms of acquiring new land, if we're taking funding for parkland acquisition, these are the kinds of lands that could be acquired in full for future park use, and taking them out of that use agreement category and putting them into a full ownership.
Through Your Worship, that is correct, and that's actually factored within the table that Matt Bennett provided, because the lease expires, I believe, in 2027. So we'd be looking potentially within the next 10 years of acquiring or not acquiring those particular lands for permanent usage.
Okay. And then I have one last question, which takes us out of the category of land ownership issues. So I recognize this report is almost entirely about how much land do we have, how much land do we need, and how do we acquire it. This question is really kind of what do we do with the land, and how do we what do we put on the land in terms of improvements? And it has to do with this long-standing question about pickleball court design and how much space there needs to be around a pickleball, and how do you separate the courts from adjacent residential uses and sensitive uses. When and how do we get into those kinds of discussions and recognize the need for different kinds of facilities in our parks, and where do they go? Where do we spread them out? You know, where do we put pickleball? Where do we put tennis? Where do we put basketball? Where do we put all these other kinds of facilities?
Councillor,
Mr. Mayor.
that'd be in your Parks Master Plan. And that's under review too. So you're going to have lots of opportunity coming up.
I recognize that. I wondered if staff could tell me when that comes back, or when we expect to see that.
Mr. Mark has risen to the answer now.
Through your worship, we will be issuing the RFP for the Parks Recreational Library Services Master Plan within the next month. We will be working on it through this fall and hope to deliver that back to council probably about Q2 of 2023.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that information. That's all.
All righty, Councillor O'Meara.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thanks to my council colleagues for the great questions so far. I'm struggling with one, maybe more of a philosophical struggle that we have here with regards to parks. And as we grow and we intensify in these areas, we seem to be concerned with a ratio of 2.2 to 1,000. But when people get intensification in their growth areas, they expect to have parks built where they're accessible to them, not a 20-minute drive away in traffic. So I'm worried about Midtown, where we're going to put 25 to 30,000 people in there, and then we're going to tell them, yeah, but all of that park land dedication is off at Brawny and Lower Baseline or something like that. So how are we trying to grapple with the fact that we're not going to be able to build the amount of parks in the growth nodes to support the people that are growing here? How do we wrestle that one to the ground?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's a huge question, and I've tried to deal with it in this report, keeping in mind the discussion of a reason to live in an urban context versus a more traditional neighborhood context in Oakville. And there are trade-offs, and absolutely access to the full suite of parkland and recreational resources is a trade-off. The decision to live in an urban context is about access to transit. It's about access to cultural facilities, museums, entertainment facilities, shopping, restaurants, where your more traditional communities go to those urban centers to use those facilities. The urban folks, for some recreational activities, will need to go elsewhere in the town. It's not an achievable number, 2.2 hectares per 1,000 people. Just do the math. If you're looking for 25,000 people, 30,000 people in Midtown, there's not enough land in Midtown. So it's really a trade-off, and it's a philosophical conversation about the decision to live in one context versus another.
Okay, yeah, I kind of didn't think there was an answer, but I appreciate the bluntness with that, and I think that's something that we need to have conversations with, communities as they grow and understand that, because the demand for it, no matter what, won't go away. If school closes, just buy it and make a park. I mean, that happens on a daily basis in Oakville. So I thank you for that. I have some questions with regards to the cash in lieu aspect of this. There's three questions really. First of all is with the appraisal and the process by which we would allow developers to question our appraisal. And I guess what is the disincentive for a developer to not protest our appraisal in the hopes that they're gonna get a better result anyway? I guess it seems like there's no downside to a developer saying, well, no matter what, I'm gonna protest this, and if I get some money off, I get some money off. But it doesn't seem like there's any incentive to come to an agreement right away and expedite the process a little bit. And I'm wondering why we would why we wouldn't just say, here's a list of 5 appraisers, you pick one and that's it. Why do we have to go through the song and dance a little bit before?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, certainly you could adjust that process. The one that's in this report, I took from the new approach for community benefits appraisal approach. If there's an idea that we would like to do something different, I think that could be identified in this report and included in the parkland dedication bylaw. There was initially an idea that the municipality would simply set land prices contextually 3 or 4 times a year and apply them. And there always has to be, however, an opportunity to challenge it. The goal is that it doesn't have to go to the OLT to be resolved, but that there's a process for resolution. What that process is, we can talk about different approaches, but there has to be a dispute resolution mechanism.
Oh, I agree with that, and I appreciate that. The one thing I hear from the development industry always is we just want certainty over timeline. It's more important than money sometimes. We just want to know how long things are going to take so we can plan accordingly. And I think anything we can do to simplify or streamline, here's the process, rather than adding a few more steps and a few more steps, I think that gives cause for concern. So anyway, maybe our staff can just note that, and we can find out a way with the development community, what would be the quickest way to come to a resolution on cash in lieu, because that always comes up, and it's always a disagreement, and I'm not sure how we get there quickly, but I think even the development community would say, if we've got to pay an extra $100,000, but it saves us 6 months of going back and forth with appraisers, that we might be willing to do that. So anyway, I'll let that one go there. My last comment is with regards to in the cash in lieu, where we talk about the categories as where we might have reduced parkland dedication and cash in lieu requirement. I think the attitude here is on page 61 is that there are still mom and pop businesses that set up retirement homes in our local communities, and we should be supporting them. Whereas I think the reality that we see is some of the richest billionaire pension plans are owning these retirement homes and centers. And I'm not sure why we would consider giving them a reduction in cash in lieu when they don't have enough pockets to stuff the cash in. So I would like to see that considered and potentially removed or realigned so that we're not favoring a handful of corporations now that are building the overwhelming majority of our retirement homes out here. So anyway, I'll maybe just leave that for fodder for staff and for yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship.
All right, Councillor Grant, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I guess the problem with raising your hand at the last second is that most of the good questions were asked ahead of time. However, and I think that my final question was partially answered through Councillor Adams's questioning, but we are only looking at land acquisition. This changes nothing about any of the other policies, I'm assuming. And specifically, I'm talking about use agreements and easements. There is a park that we have an agreement with through the region of Halton. And for the longest time, Councillor Noel and I have been trying to get some good play equipment put onto that land. Certainly, I'm assuming now from what I've heard from an answer to Councillor Adams's question, this changes nothing about that. We can't just turn around and say, now that we have this use agreement, can we now put playground equipment onto this property? Would that be true?
I think that's a question for Mr. Mark or the Commissioner.
Yeah.
Through you, Your Worship, certainly the report that's being presented this morning doesn't change any lease agreements, any agreements we have with any other entities at this time. I know specifically what you're referring to, Reservoir Park, and we continue to have ongoing discussions with the region regarding the ability to place playground equipment in that park. They are doing a study, And they've committed to myself as well as to both ward councillors that they will get back to us when they're finished that study to determine if playground equipment or some other form of community asset can be put in Reservoir Park. So we'll likely also look at that in the context of our Parks and Rec master plan as well, because we have identified a need in that area for play equipment, and it meets the standard we have. So we certainly will bring that forward as we did in the last master plan and say that that is a gap we need to close within our Parks and Rec master plan.
Okay. Thank you very much for scratching that itch. Like I said, all the good questions were taken. Okay. Thank you.
It's okay. There's not a contest going on here. Councillor Robertson?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. And it's something I'm very interested in terms of accumulating meaningful parkland. So one of my questions has to do with the partnerships element. And in cash in lieu, I know that the ultimate goal is to bank land, but can we set aside a particular lease agreement in that, or a percentage of it to go to lease agreements for something like leasing land from Bronte Provincial Park from the provincial government to be able to do things that are lacking in that side? So let's say that the west end of Oakville in the north has no soccer fields, no decent amenities for anything, and there's a lot of new development in that area. Can cash in lieu work to lease on a continuous basis, or is the ultimate goal to always be able to purchase?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's a very interesting question. In my mind, subject to a legal opinion, any kind of securement can be de facto ownership. If you have an easement or some kind of legal agreement for use, that can be considered securement. And in my mind, funding could come from the cash in lieu bank account. The proviso I have on that answer is that I would need to consult with a lawyer to determine if that is true.
Okay.
We'll take that as a maybe then.
That's a solid, that's a solid maybe.
Yes, and definitely something for our park staff to note in terms of developing partnerships. The other one I have comes back to the POPs. So we have a development right now that potentially could go to the OLT that has proposed a POPs. Our greatest reservation with the POPs is not the maintenance aspect, although that's important. It is the security and bylaw element. If you have a ton of teenagers that hang at it and they're disruptive and they're causing trouble, who pays for bylaw enforcement at a POP? Is it the developer that is doing it? Do they have to pay extra in the legal agreement, or do we just take it for the team?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I believe that would need to be dealt with in the legal agreement that comes along with the POP.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all my questions.
All righty, Councillor Giddings.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, got a couple of questions that haven't been touched on yet. In this study, you mentioned that every municipality in the GTHA is going through the same steps that we are, given the provincial deadline. In chart or appendix 7, it talked about urban parkland systems throughout primarily, well, Canada and major US cities. Would it be possible for you to send to us or send to staff through to us some comparators in the GTHA? Just to see, it sounds like that information may be available.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, examples of urban park systems or?
The number of hectares per thousand, for example.
Yeah, I can find that very quickly.
All right. That would be great.
Yeah, you should know that Oakville is one of the highest. which reflects the quality of your system, I think.
Couldn't agree more. It would be great to see that information. I very much appreciated report, the town page 20, or your report, page 14, the quality of place and quality of life statements in terms of healthy and complete communities, sense of development, psychological, physical, crime reduction, environmental indicators. It's a very compelling case, as you said, we have a higher level of park space, and our quality of life may be attributed partially to this. We had a rich discussion concerning Midtown at a recent meeting of council regarding an OPA, and Councillor O'Meara mentioned it earlier. As we build out, it may not be 20 or 30,000, it may be 40 or 50,000 people in that area, combined with the Bronte GO station and what's happening in downtown Bronte, and in Ward 2 at Kerr and Spears and the infill projects that are coming in Ward 2. How do we accommodate this? I know we're looking at 2031, but 2041 and 2051 will follow quickly on the heels. How do we ensure that we have enough placeholders or enough money in reserves to be able to offer future residents, as Councillor O'Meara said, a sense of complete community?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's another really important question. This particular work and the bylaw that will go with it, we selected 2031, keeping in mind that it's very likely that this bylaw and this report should be reviewed probably every 5 years to ensure that it remains relevant to what's actually going on the ground in Oakville. We know that today you have a certain balance between greenfield forms of development and intensification in your strategic growth areas. And over time, that balance is going to change. And as you become more and more urban, you will need to test what is in this report and what is in this bylaw as it comes forward to make sure that it's working. The key here is that everybody else who's doing these studies, with the exception of Toronto, is in the same situation as you are. They are urbanizing, and they're focusing more and more growth on these intensification areas. What this report does is give you the baseline for a quantum within a strategic growth areas of about 7.5 to 12% of the gross land area. That is a number that the sooner you can get that, the better it is, and then you grow up around it. I haven't particularly articulated that in the recommendations, but perhaps that could be an addition. It's easier to get when there's land available, and it's really important. I did a similar study in Yorkville in Toronto, and it seems that the park system, which improves only with small elements, is still well liked by the residents because it's diverse and it changes all the time. The challenge we have in Yorkville is maintenance, because the maintenance protocols have not caught up to the level of use. So I think that we really need to look at what's going on in this report and subsequent bylaw and keep on top of it. Make sure that we're always testing what's working. But I think a key element is in a strategic growth area, try to get that gross land area sooner rather than later.
I thank you for that. I couldn't agree more. On your page 26 of your report, it talks about the refining of active parkland to include a more fulsome list of recreational opportunities, including non-intensive recreational activities such as trails and the enjoyment of nature. Could you just flesh that out a little bit? A trail is certainly active. I would consider it for those that cycle or hike or walk. Am I misinterpreting that, or?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, no, you're not misinterpreting it. What I'm working with in this document is your current definition of active parkland. It could be expanded as needed, because remember, what I'm trying to do is in the future, beyond 2031, give you opportunities to continue to achieve or exceed your 2.2 hectares per thousand. Absolutely, there are different types of parks and facilities that are not soccer fields, baseball diamonds, pickleball, courts, whatever they are. Trails, bicycle trails, pedestrian trails kind of fall somewhere in the middle. But certainly, for example, in your natural heritage system, you have all those wonderful linear opportunities that the buffer areas could become more of a element of your overall campus of facilities and count towards active parkland. Another idea is, and again, we'll look at Bronte Provincial Park, it incorporates a huge environmental element within it. And you could create a park where environmental education and much simpler, less active elements of active parkland are included and promoted as a different kind of park. Equally important, a new kind of element or an additional element in your active parkland definition. And again, an opportunity to keep up with that 2.2 hectares per thousand as land resources dwindle over time.
Thank you. And so that would include the eco park, community gardens, pollinator, butterfly gardens. You may not be running around, but residents are getting a sense of enjoyment from that.
Correct. Exactly what I'm thinking.
All right. On the same page, the recommendation is to look at rephrasing the active parkland target as an aspirational target. I read that and it says to me that 2.2 is going to be pretty tough to hit. Perhaps we should lower the standard that we have in mind.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Again, another good question. I don't believe you need to do that for quite some time. And in fact, you'd probably be better served to do some of the other tweaks rather than reconsider your 2.2 per thousand. I believe that that's fully achievable in 2031. But when you're reviewing this work in a number of years, you'll want to think about what that number means, what it includes, and how it's going to be achieved. The end of the day, if you can no longer achieve it in 2056, then you should think about what a new number might be. And that number comes from the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. And that is linked back to facilities as well as parkland. So I don't see a need to do that at this time. And I still believe it's a good aspirational target going forward. You can achieve it now.
You mentioned the Parks Library Master Plan, and both of these are tied in so closely together, which is why the recommendation is to update it on a regular basis to look at the land that's been gained, the popularity of the next sport after pickleball or whatever it is, correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, absolutely correct.
All right, and some of the definitions, last question, I like to thank my council colleagues. So looking at the Midtown area, the absolute cost of the land, does the cemetery in that area become active parkland with a possible lack of open space?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I don't really have an opinion on that. Cemeteries are quite a bit different. However, people certainly walk through them, enjoy them, but I think it might be a bit aggressive to think of it as an active park, at least under current definitions.
Good stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor Giddings. As you know, but the public may not, that's the second location for that cemetery. A great storm having decided that it couldn't stay where it was. Councillor Palmer?
Thank you, Worship. Thank you for your presentation and report. I just wanted to touch a little bit on the ratio again in terms of the strategic growth areas. And you mentioned in your answer to Councillor Giddings that your recommendation would be to achieve that gross parkland now in order to have placeholders for the future. And I'm just trying to understand, would it make sense to have a target ratio for our strategic growth areas? So Midtown and Trafalgar, Dundas, or Palermo, like we have quite a few. So would it make sense to have a ratio that we want as a threshold for consistency across our growth area?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that would make some sense. What I've done in this report is give you a range. Certainly, all of your strategic growth areas are not at the same level of growth or comprehensive planning. So the range, in my mind, is intended to give the town the opportunity to apply different numbers depending on the opportunity to achieve a parkland system within those areas. I have not looked at individual strategic growth areas in Oakville to determine where within that range they should fall.
Okay, so there's a range. Okay, great. And then I think it's a good answer, but I just wanted to confirm for our libraries, because, as we're talking about the plans for North Park, we're talking about an outdoor library space. And so I assume then that space would also be considered active parkland?
I'm going to have to defer to Chris on that.
Through your worship, yes, we would count that as active parkland.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Haslett-Deal.
Thank you, Mayor Burton, and thank you to my council colleagues for all the great questions. So I'm going to jump around a little bit, trying to make sure that I've covered all the ones that may not have gotten covered. So you used the word, you talked about transit-oriented communities and that there's some legislative changes that could impact or quote unquote limit parkland, but you thought that it may only be relate to subway type transit-oriented communities. Given the deadline and the magnitude of what and reach of the provincial government on our jurisdiction, what is the potential limit of parkland if it was determined it applied to our growth areas, particularly Bronte and Midtown?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, for the larger scale sites, I believe it's 25% of the gross land area.
Okay, so we have 103 hectares of gross land in Midtown, so 25% of that would be the maximum parkland availability. How, can you just give me a little bit more insight?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the 25% is land or cash in lieu of land or some combination thereof. So in terms of what we're presenting in this report, we're looking for less than 25% of the gross land area, but the rest of it in cash to acquire land elsewhere. That's the approach we've taken in this report.
Okay. I appreciated in particular a couple of my council colleagues' comments about parkland and acquisition earlier rather than later, which I think you had suggested would be a wise decision on our part. One of my concerns is you used a phrase that a reason to live somewhere and a trade-off, and that is a philosophical decision. And I'm not sure when we have that discussion or debate, but I would put to you that it is both an affordability, as not necessarily a decision to, I don't want to have green space. In fact, what I started out to, when I started writing comments about the report, was to applaud the quality in here that speaks to the importance of parks. And in fact, you state in the report that it is even more important in urban areas than in other areas. So I'm not sure it should be a trade-off, and I'm a bit concerned that there's a lens potentially coming through that it just can't be done. And that we need to compromise right at the outset versus set a bar that says the research is pretty clear that urbanized areas and individuals who live in urban areas do value and need green space. So with that said, I'm curious why POPs we would recommend counting that as parkland dedication when we really need to ensure maximum parkland is available in these growth areas. Could you comment on that for me?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I don't see POPs as the only urban park space. It's you need all of the elements in a strategic growth area, some of which can be POPs. In the recommendations, I've limited the consideration of POPs to the smaller scale elements of the system, but the entire system needs to be incorporated in a strategic growth area. And that may be fee simple, strata, and POPs.
Okay, but if we in fact give them credit for that land, can you help me understand, are we then getting additional or have the opportunity to require additional land as part of their development?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we're anticipating that the POPs would be discounted significantly. They're already small. There'll be a very limited element of the number, so I don't see a need to do that.
Okay, so for my own clarity, I'm developing a piece of land in a strategic growth area. I'm going to, the town, if this all goes through, would have the choice of whether it's land acquisition or cash in lieu. If we in fact want land and therefore aim wisely to acquire land sooner rather than later, are we, are we going to be aiming for more than 5%? Because the numbers you've indicated would say we need to aim for higher than 5%. In fact, I think I saw 7.5% to 12% of the gross land area should be park. So can you help me with my confusion on this?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'll give it a shot.
Thank you.
The 7.5 to 12% is a number of land area that you should have within a strategic growth area, somewhere in that range, to have a reasonable urban park system. Whether it's fee simple, strata, or POP, or some combination of all three, should not matter to a significant degree, as long as you have the space. If it looks like a park and it acts like a park, it's a park. That number is nowhere near the numbers that you will generate through the parkland dedication bylaw. So once you've achieved your 7.5 to 12, then there's nothing to say you have to stop there. But you will have to decide on a case-by-case basis whether or not you want more land within the strategic growth areas, or whether you're willing to accept cash in lieu to acquire land elsewhere in the town. We're not being so prescriptive in this document that it's X, Y, Z. It's a little bit X, it's a little bit of Y, it's a little bit of Z. And where you end up with opportunities to acquire, you should acquire.
Okay, thank you for that. So I guess my question is for Director Mark or Director Charles, if he's present. What would be the land mass that is in the public realm document from the strategic growth area called Midtown? How many hectares is that public realm providing?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, testing my memory here, Councillor, but I believe it was about 40%, roughly 40 hectares was full public realm within Midtown. And so that would include the roads, parkland, top of bank, hydrolands, existing parks, etc.
So I didn't ask my question very clearly. My apologies. So how much of that would be counted as park? So you have a schedule that outlines a possible recommendation for parks. How much acreage is that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I don't know what the exact percentage was, but I believe it was around 8%, and we can confirm that when we bring information back on Midtown.
Yes, I do think that it's an important understanding for this report, because it reflects how does that come to life in our strategic growth areas. And so I'd appreciate seeing it before Midtown comes back, because I think we have the number of 5% and the language needs to support ensuring we intend to achieve in our strategic growth areas sufficient land, whether it's called urban parks or a different definition of a park in those areas. I'm going to switch gears just a little. There's a comment in the report about household sizes decreasing, and I'm just not sure where that's coming from. It was on page 37, and it seems to drive a sense that we might need less. And if somebody could just clarify, that would, and I don't need that clarification today, but I'd appreciate where that's coming from in terms of, I don't know if that's number of people in a unit. I don't know that it factors in multi-generational families, which we see increasingly moving into Oakville and having needs within our community that we should be planning to support.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the decreasing household size is a common demographic conclusion that's been happening in Ontario for quite some time. There's two aspects to that here in Oakville, and multi-generational housing is an interesting conversation, because it may reduce the reduction in household size somewhat. However, the other element of reducing household size is a switch in built form to higher intensity uses that tend to have fewer and fewer people living in them. So it's a broad demographic statement that is a trend in Ontario that has been going on for about 20 years.
Well, I'll thank you for that answer, but I think that I'd question if the last 20 is the benchmark, and if it's not the future 20 that we should be thinking about. I have two last questions, and that is, there was a comment about being able to have green space over top of stormwater. And I'm just wondering if that is a realistic, achievable target for us, given how we've built out so far, It'd be certainly interesting to be able to achieve that, given the number of people who wanted ice rinks on our stormwater ponds in the last few years. So is that in the realm of possibility? And I'm not sure which director answers that.
Through Mr. Mayor, I'll give it a start, and happy to have my answer augmented. It's certainly an approach that the development industry is very interested in, primarily because they're trying to be more efficient with some of that infrastructure that is required in a traditional neighborhood development. It certainly can work from an engineering perspective. Whether or not you want to do it is another conversation. It's in the report because we know we have to deal with it in some way in order to have the conversation.
Okay, so something to investigate if and to perhaps optimize. I wanted to end on a positive, which is I wanted to thank you for some of the charts that showed us the cost per unit. I was really appreciative of Councillor Duddick's further explanation of the developer's contribution, because I do think it's important for us to understand what is the sum total of that investment that and the contribution they're making, DC, community benefit, and parkland or cash in lieu, because it is relative to also determining how significantly we intensify in our strategic growth areas, and understand the profitability of those developments, as well as their investment in our community. So thank you for that, and I look forward to more information.
All right, that's Councillor Lischina.
Thank you, Your Worship. My apologies, I'm in clinic. Just a quick question based on everybody else's questions. The point about if you're in a strategic growth area and then in the bylaws, is there any point in making language saying that if possible to actually have it as close as possible to the location of the development? So the parkland be as close as possible, or at least that be the first option. And then if that's not possible for whatever reason, then it goes into a different part of town. Is that too detailed of language for a bylaw?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. No. In fact, the City of Markham has a proximity ring that they look for land generated in strategic growth areas to be within 800 meters of, I think it's 800. I better not say the number. A proximity policy that will be in their bylaw.
Is that something that you would be willing to consider as part of your recommendations to council?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm happy to consider anything in conversations with staff, and certainly.
All right, thank you, Councillor. We have some hands still up. I don't know whether they're second rounders or forgetful. The hands that are up are Councillor Palmer, and you're next if you want a question. And if that was okay, then Councillor Knoll gets to be our first second timer. Councillor Knoll.
Hoping I don't open a floodgate, but I had abandoned my position before because I wanted to let everybody else have a chance. I have a couple minor little follow-up questions. With respect to the land banking concept, I think that's brilliant as a hedge against inflation and costs of land that seem to increase. Are there any regulatory issues with that? Do we have any hoops that we have to jump through, or special considerations given to land banking whether from a financial or even from a I guess an administrator's perspective?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Again, a great question. You'll note that the recommendation is a recommendation to consider.
Yeah, I saw that.
That's because we don't know some of the answers to those exact questions that you're asking.
Okay. So that's something we'll explore going forward. Yeah, it's certainly a great idea. I note on the page that talks about what can't, on the report, what can't be, one of the recommendations include what can't be considered as land, and one of them talks about stormwater management facilities. Is there some metric that is industry standard or that would be applied to the policy in terms of what kind of, obviously the pond itself would not be calculated in the land dedication, but I'm assuming that the wording means that the land surrounding it, if provided for the purposes of a park space, for example, Memorial Park in my ward, would be in that calculation. Is there any kind of calculation method to determine what is actually required for the stormwater management pond in addition to the pond itself? Or is it simply just everything outside of the watermark is considered potentially parkland dedication? I'm sorry if that's a little obtuse. I'm trying to figure out a better way to articulate it. Is that?
Through you, I understand the question, through you, Mr. Mayor. I don't know what your current practices are, but it would make sense that some element of the lands surrounding the storm facility itself, depending on how it's designed and what it's used for, could count. But I don't know what you typically do today on that.
Okay. I wonder if that, maybe I don't need an answer for it today, but I wonder if we could have that addressed in a future update. I'm just curious, because I know that it's been applied in Ward 5 and in Ward 7, probably elsewhere as well. I think in Ward 6 too, but I'm just curious how that would work. In terms of, and again, I'm sorry, this is really minutia. Maybe you already covered it and I just didn't understand the answer previously, but with respect to the three, I guess, acquisition models, fee simple, POP, and Strata, I know that the POP and Strata would be discounted from a value perspective, but are they also discounted from a calculation of landmass perspective? So would 1 hectare of fee simple land dedication be equivalent to the physicality of 1 hectare of a Strata agreement or a POP agreement?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I look at value both as land area and fiscal value.
Okay, because clearly a Strata park or even a POP park wouldn't have the same, I guess, intrinsic value to the community as would a fee simple owned park. So I just wanted to hear that. Once again, thank you. Like I said, those are just simple little questions. I just wanted to get those clarified. Thank you very much.
All right, Councillor Hazard-Thiel, welcome back.
Thank you. I just wanted to reference recommendation 39. It says that a priority land acquisition strategy be done annually. And I guess relative to the acquisition for parkland. And I was a bit surprised to see annually. Would you perhaps suggest that it is a 5 to 10 year plan that is reviewed annually, or is that what you meant?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the key issue is you've got to try and spend the money when you get the money, because that's when the highest value of the cash is. So I don't know how the town would like to put together their strategy. Certainly, if it's for capital expenditure, they would want some level of approval to spend money, and they'd probably want to do that annually. However, the strategy could be reviewed over a long period of time, as long as the amounts were allocated on a relatively frequent basis. The goal, and I'm going to use the City of Toronto as the worst possible example. They have $1.4 billion in their parkland dedication account, and they won't buy any land because it's too expensive. We don't want the situation here where the process to acquire a parcel of land is so cumbersome that you miss the opportunity or the price goes up to a point that is not considered reasonable. So whatever wording adjustments we want to make to achieve the objective of keeping the town nimble enough to make acquisitions in a nimble, timely way. I'm happy to make adjustments.
I couldn't agree with you more that we need to be able to go after the opportunity when it's in front of us. It's also from a public and transparent nature. It'd be good to be able to lay that out on a map and say, this is what we're aiming to do. So I'm going to follow from that. There is a recommendation 31. It talks about OPA and rezoning and the determination of whether it be cash in lieu or land. And then it follows from that, well, who decides? And so I'm just wondering if the OPA, if I understand this correctly, the OPA says, this is what we will ask for. So we do get prescriptive in that regard. Is it only when it is a OPA or a rezoning that it would come back to council, or will it always come to council on a planning application, whether or not it will be land or cash in lieu? I just would like clarity on that for the public.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, any planning application where you have the opportunity to apply a parkland dedication, you should have the opportunity to determine whether it's cash, land, or some combination of both.
So it is a council decision?
Well, it could in fact be part of the bylaw to make it a council decision.
Okay. Well, thank you for allowing me to ask those additional questions. And from a public transparency perspective, I would like to see it be a council decision. Thanks very much for your report and your time today.
Thank you, everybody. I just want to offer a couple of comments. There were some recommendations that caused me some concern. As a category, I've made a partial list. But they fall into a broad category of let's give discounts or exemptions. And I don't like to give discounts or exemptions. I certainly don't want to prescribe that things are exempt or discounted in advance if we can avoid it. I'm happy to let council exercise its will on a case-by-case basis, but I'm pretty sure this council doesn't want to give the store away in a blanket kind of way. And these recommendations that are a concern to me, number 20, on page 25, there's a remark that amounts to a recommendation, and it may actually be a recommendation that actually goes to this as well. But on page 25, you talk about we have to be concerned about the feasibility of parkland being acquired in expensive, in cases where the land is very expensive. And my appreciation of how development works is that the land is acquired and then flipped many times, and among the members of the industry, sometimes within companies with the industry. Anyway, the short form of what I'm going to say is the developers have some responsibility, maybe not all of it, for the problem they complain about, which is that the land is too expensive. And I hate to see the public, be the one who suffers for their creation of that. To the degree that they create that problem, I don't think the public should pay for it. In recommendation 13, and I'll start with 11. Another councillor mentioned it. In recommendation 11, apparently there was a suggestion, if I understood the discussion correctly, someone read that as advocating for some idea of less maintenance, and that's contrary to the town's, the population of the town's expectations about parkland. They like everything pristine, so I just want to ring that bell. And then recommendation 13, 14, and 17 are about exemptions, and so those are three that I have a lot of reservations about. Recommendation 20 talks about the 7.5%. And in your discussion today, you were 7.5 to 12, which is a little more aspirational. 7.5 is already aspirational in a legislative regime that limits you to 5. So we need to think carefully about how aspirational we want to be. But it's clear from everybody's comments today that aspiration is Oakville. So we need to think about that when we're
just to
finalizing
clarify,
this.
you're not limited to 5.
No, in the parkland dedication legislation in the Planning Act, you covered that at the front. 2% for commercial and commercial,
industrial,
5% for residential, 5% for industrial. So we want to be aspirational is all I'm trying to say.
Yes, and the Planning Act gives you the flexibility on residential to go well beyond 5.
Well, you also said that 1 for 300 is only a little bit more than 5%.
No. What I said, 1 hectare per 300 is only a little bit more in a greenfield situation where densities are around 50 persons per hectare, which is a fairly typical number. In an urban context, that 1 hectare per 300 can be 4 or 5 times the site area because of the dwelling unit measure. So you have 7.5 to 12 is achievable. It's aspirational for sure, but it's achievable. And you can also get that land and generate cash in lieu.
Okay. So anyway, I'll just fall back to Oakville's aspirational. In recommendation 22, you were discussing a formula for mixed use. And I think that needs to be looked at very carefully in the light of this. Let's not cut away any more than the province makes us cut away, I guess is what I'm trying to say. 42 was another exemption, and so it caught my eye. 43 was a reduction for certain categories, so that caught my eye. 44 was an exemption, same thing. And in 46, you talked about accepting. So what happens in Oakville is the natural heritage system, the landowners invariably give it to us because it saves them taxes. I don't think we want to be accepting NHS as parkland in lieu of parkland dedication. So, we have an existing thing around the natural heritage system, and it would be, I think, it would cut away from how well we're doing if we started recognizing. I'm perfectly fine with using the usable parts of the NHS for passive and semi-active parkland like trails and such, and we do that. I just don't want to, make the mistake of having NHS become dedicated parkland. Those are my comments, and I thank you for the attention you gave them. Council, we are now at the point where if you have no further questions, we could have a mover and seconder, or actually, yes, a mover and seconder to receive the information. Councillor Knoll and Councillor Chisholm, thank you very much. Any objection? Madam Clerk, there being none, that motion carries. And we also could give 2 people a chance to move and second the confirmatory bylaw. Councillor Grant and Councillor Giddings, thank you. Any objection? There being none, that's carried as well. Thank you, everybody, for the obvious amount of work you did in preparing for this meeting and the many fine questions. I think we moved forward a great way towards a good outcome in September, and it's been great working with you. That's the end of the meeting.